Okay, everybody. So on today's show, I've got an exclusive. What hasn't been done in a long time is there's a lot of information on the Type threes, but I don't think it's been served any justice. And of course, like always, I'm here to try to bring you guys the most information that I can on these particular models. And on today's podcast, we're going to be doing a Type three special specifically to early Type threes. And my guest today is who's been on the podcast before is Lee Hedges. Lee, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how's it going? Good to have you back.
Yeah, so good to have you back here, Lee. And so my question is, as we get this started, today's show is going to be specifically on the early Type threes, and we're going to be using your Type three, which is being featured in Hot VWs, as kind of exclusive for us to kind of walk around, get an idea of what we're looking at, and just give us some information on the early Type threes. Now, just to get everybody up to speed, with respect to the Type 3, can you give us a little upfront history on the reason Volkswagen developed the Type 3 to begin with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really cool story because in the late 50s, Volkswagen was really starting their export program, export to the U.S., and the U.S. just start gobbling up Volkswagens. And they noticed, as they did in the rest of the countries around the world, that they had the Beetle, they had the bus, and they had the Type 14 Karmann Ghia. They were all running on the same motor. So when Americans got involved, because Americans like a little bit more power, a little bit more comfort, a little bit more space, they noticed that they needed to generate a series of cars that were in the 1500 cc class, which the Beetle was at 11 and 1200 cc. So they came up with an idea. Heinz Nordhoff was the managing director there at Volkswagen, and he came up with an idea that we needed a 3-compartment design, where the Beetle just had the back seat and the front hood to store stuff, and the bus, same thing. They needed to be able to put things in 3 different compartments, which was the norm for more of the middle class cars that had a little bit more power, had a little bit more comfort, a lot more standard features, more space for storage. And so the Type 3 line was developed in secret, actually, beginning in 1957 and 58, where they had a burned out building at Wolfsburg, and they just kept the windows closed up, and they started doing development for the Type 3 or the VW 1500 series in this building. Nobody knew about it. Access to the building was strictly prohibited, and even people at Volkswagen didn't know about it. The big reason is because they were worried that the public was going to think that Volkswagen was going to end of life the Beetle, which was never the case. The Type 3 series was always going to be in addition to the Beetle and the Transporter series.
And I think that maybe one of the things that, I think a lot is that, at least that was my impression. The Type 3 was built to replace, I don't want to say replace the Beetle, but it was built to be like Volkswagen's real car per se.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely had a lot more modern features to it than the Beetle or the bus ever did.
A lot more. It was really a lot more of an optioned vehicle compared to the Beetle, right? I mean, that's the reason that the platform came. It came with a full line of the platform. What did they debut at the auto show?
So at the Frankfurt Auto Show in September of '61, they announced it to the public and had there's 2 different booths there. There was a Volkswagen booth and there was a Karmann booth, because Karmann, of course, had built the convertibles and the Type 14 Ghias. So in the Volkswagen booth, they had the sedan, the notchback, they had the estate wagon, which was the variant, and they had a notchback convertible as well, which was a 4-seater prototype at the time that they fully intended to build but never did. And then in the Karmann booth, they had the Type 34 Karmann Ghia Coupe and the Type 34 Karmann Ghia Cabriolet. Again, the Cabriolet had really limited production and then was stopped early on. So there were 5 models in the VW 1500 early series that they launched in 1961.
I mean, that was pretty revolutionary for Volkswagen, that they had really a hit with the Beetle, and then they end up deciding we're just going to come out with the Type 3, we're coming out with 5 different platforms. I mean, so they really must have had a lot of confidence in the Type 3 and where it was going to go. What about How was it received from a sales standpoint when it was, first put out there?
Well, the Type 3 was 25% bigger, 25% stronger engine, more space inside, more comfort inside. And so right away, all the public saw was a much more advanced vehicle. It had mechanically a lower center of gravity motor in the back that was a different design, and it produced more horsepower. It produced 45 horsepower at that point, and the later ones 50 and 55 horsepower. So it just had all the advanced features that the Beetle wasn't going to get for several more years.
Now, in this podcast that we're doing right now, this one is going to be specifically talking about, because when we look at the Type 3 platform as a whole, if we're looking at generations, there's really the first and second generation, but the first generation can actually split into two, maybe even three different categories. How would you classify the Type 3s as far as the 62 to 69 models? Would you say there's two
So
kind of early and late of the early style?
yeah, I mean, for me, the 61, 62, and 63 are considered the early style, where it has a lot of features that were never featured again and real easy to identify. And then you have the S model series with the N model series in 64 and 5 that had high compression motor, and was the first Volkswagen to reach 100 miles an hour. That was a big deal. And then in 66 through 69, they went back to sort of a pedestrian, lower compression, lower, better maintenance kind of version. And that's when they launched the Fastback as well. So they came out with an additional model line in 66. So I think of basically three different eras of cars during that time. And there's easy ways to identify each one of them.
So let's just start with, in particular, the spotter's guide, right? From outside, from 20 feet away, how do you identify like a really early squareback?
The easiest thing to look for is called the high side marker lights. And so those are a side light that's on the belt line of the car that's just above the body midline. And early Type 3s never had any body trim. So this line that goes down the center of the car, all the way around the whole car, didn't have any body trim. And in later years, in 64, they came out with an aluminum trim. So if you look at a car and you see one without trim and it has the high side marker light, then that's the easiest way to identify an early 63 and earlier Type 3.
So the first thing, when you see a shaved, quote unquote, shaved squareback, it could be an early one that you see, right?
Right. And then there's another one that if you look down on the bottom where the reflector isn't chromed. The base of the reflector is painted the body color. So that blends in and it's a short reflector. Back in 64, when they came out with the 100 mile an hour S models, it was a chrome wraparound one that went around the whole back end of the car. Real easy to spot a chrome version. And that was continued all the way through the series. So if you look for the very short version of those rear reflectors, you'll notice that that's the early style. If you look at the flat taillight lenses, these hug and conform with the fender design here. In 64, they changed it to the ones that have a wider lens that comes out more, so the visibility is better. But the flat lenses are another feature of an early car.
So
from 20 feet, it may or may not be able to tell, but the back window trim is wider on the early cars as well. So all the trims, the aluminum trims that go around the windows and on the back windows, they're wider than the 64 models, which are thinner.
So so just to clarify, the flat lenses, which in the 90s customization of the Type 3 era, the flat lenses were up to 63 only.
Yeah, everybody used those. The 64 models, when they came out with the S models, came out with the bigger lenses.
And now, with respect to exterior, there's also, because it didn't have the side belt line trim, it was also lacking the front hood as well.
Yeah, the aluminum trim that runs along the lower portion of the front hood where you lift the front hood up. On the later models, they have an aluminum trim there. On the early models, no trim at all, as clean as can be. And the earliest of them even have a rounded VW emblem, which is very, very rare. But the no hood trim is a big, easy way to spot an early car. The rims as well. If you look at the rims of the car, in the early years, they two-toned the rims. The early Type 3s have a light-colored outer rim color and a dark color disc color, so a two-tone rim. It didn't come with trim rings because they were two-toned. They were pretty enough as they were, and you just had the chrome hubcap to make things look nice. In the 64 model, they came out with an aluminum trim ring that covered up the entire rim, so you didn't see anything other than the black rim behind it. So
now, what's interesting is a few months back, I had posted. I was at my friend's yard, longtime VW guy, and we found a wheel there that we couldn't identify, and it looked kind of like a bus wheel. It looked like a 14-inch bus wheel, but it was 15 inches, and we just couldn't make sense of it. And then I posted on my Instagram, and you immediately chimed in and said, that's an early Type 3 wheel, because we were looking at it like, wow, it's kind of weird. It's like a bus wheel, but it doesn't have hubcap clips on it because it takes a late model style hubcap, or I guess that would just be a Type 3 style hubcap, right? Which later moved on to the Beetle as well.
If you look on the inside of that rim where the clips normally are on a Beetle or a bus, you don't have any hubcap clips. You just have these little nubs. There's 3 little nubs that are built into the rim to hold the hubcap.
Yeah, no. So I thought it was neat that, he and I were stumped, and immediately you chimed in and said, nope, that's an early Type 3 wheel. So I thought that was pretty
interesting. And that's a valuable wheel. You send that to me, will you? I need one of those.
I'll get you that wheel, buddy. Don't you worry about that. Consider it yours. So now finishing talking about the front end, what else on the front end is different on an early Type 3?
So the earliest Type 3s had bullet front turn signals. So just like you see on a 50s bus or on an early Type 14 Ghia, you had these little pointed bullet turn signals. And those were unique to the earliest years as well. Because they were never exported to the US in those years, you didn't have sealed beam headlights. So their headlights are going to be the European bulb style headlight with the SB12 chrome ring, same one that's used on a Beetle. So the front end looked really simple with the no trim, no extras, one set of headlights, and just the bullets up front.
And then there's one more other thing on the exterior. Well, 2 more other things on the exterior of the car that I can remember. And one's near the rocker area.
Right. So in the rockers here, you have what's called a slash trim, and it's a rocker trim, a wide rocker trim that at the very end of it, it has a slash design. Instead of being blunt straight up and down, it's got an angled slash design to it for the rocker panel areas. And those were used just on the early ones as well.
Yeah. And as you're talking about this, I've got pictures coming up on the screen of all the stuff we're talking about. So I've got your back, buddy. And then
there's one more thing that is kind of neat is that squarebacks or variants had a stationary window in the very back, and then they had a pop-out window as an option in this middle window here behind the door. And so in this case, in the earliest ones, this was not a standard feature. You had to order pop-out windows as an extra item. And so this one is early enough where that item wasn't available. So it has stationary windows on both sides here. And you can see the reason why they'd want that pop-out window is to help ventilation for those rear seat passengers. So that optional item became a thing, and then eventually became a standard item.
Now, speaking of production numbers of the early Type 3s, the first segment, 61 through 63s, what do we have in respect to production, and what do we have that we know of in the registry?
So unfortunately, Volkswagen did not share their production numbers for the Type 3 models for that year, for those early years. We know that they made 3 million Type 3s. There's been tons made. but the earliest years all were pre-America export. So the production was really low, and they made many more notchbacks than they did squarebacks, more than variants. For obvious reasons, that the notchback was a sedan, like a Beetle version, so it was less expensive. The variant was 25% more and less production. So there were many more notchbacks out there made in the early years than the early variants. Also, the variants didn't start production until March of 1962, where the notchbacks had started production way back in mid-61. So there were almost a whole year worth of production of notchbacks before the variants were even started to be built.
That's
now, as
interesting.
far as numbers left, I've been trying to collect the serial, the VIN numbers for all the early variants out there in the whole world. And we've been doing this now for about 5 years, and we only have 75 cars known. That is ridiculously low for 63 and 62 variants. There's only 5 right-hand drive early cars known and 70 left-hand drive cars known. So it's, by comparison, I also keep track of the Type 34 group. And in 1963, there's over 263 Type 34s, and there's only 75 total 62 and 3 variants. So it's almost an unknown thing, and I didn't know it either until I started figuring it out, that you just don't ever see these out here anymore.
Yeah, so I mean, so now you're talking 62 and 63. So we don't have the production numbers, but basically what we see out there available for sale is like super rare if you can find them. And then
Yep.
what would be the holy grail of early Type 3 variants to find?
Well, I mean, anything with a low mileage original paint, of course. The problem with variants were they were commercial use vehicles. They were used by TV repairmen. They were used by florists. They were used by mechanics. They transported goods just like a truck would, and so they get abused pretty badly, and not a lot of them survive when they get abused that much. I think that's part of it.
Now,
there are no sunroofs on early variant cars. We have 0 sunroofs, which tells you that as a commercial type vehicle for transport, you didn't need an extra sunroof. Notchbacks had sunroofs, Type 34s even had sunroofs, but not the variant in the early years.
And what was so what's the first year sunroof for the Type 3 model altogether?
Well, they had them in 62 on notchbacks.
So notchbacks,
and they had them in late 62 for Type 34s.
Okay, so 62 that they were available, but and then in the notchbacks they were manual, and the Type 34s they were electric.
Yeah, notchbacks were a hand crank where you cranked this handle and then the notchback sunroof slowly opened up. On a Type 34, you had an electric button, and the electric sunroof motor in the back pulled the sunroof open and closed.
That's great. Do you know how much the sunroof option was?
I think it was 750 Deutschmarks. So divide that by 4, and you get dollars, a couple $100.
Yeah. So, and that was fairly expensive.
Seems like it'd be worth it, huh?
Right. In today's money. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I would take, if I was going back, I would have taken the notch convertible and the Type 34 convertible, just because they were only 750 more than that.
Now, speaking of, and that's one question maybe that I've been wanting to know for a long time. With the notchback convertible and the Type 3 convertible, were they actually ever produced, or were they all prototypes?
The notchback 4-seater convertible was built as prototypes and extensively tested by Carmen. And then it was decided that they were going to remain prototype production and never be mass produced. And there were several made. There was one that was crashed. And I believe today there are 2, both at Volkswagen's museum, one in the display area, which is red, and one that's hidden down in the downstairs basement. So there's 2 notchback convertibles left. Type 34s, they planned to go to production with the convertible. So in 61 and 62, they started testing of that convertible version. In late 1962, in October, November timeframe, they actually put it into production, and Karmann started building convertible Type 34s. They got to finishing 15 of them, and Volkswagen pulled the plug on the series because, well, for a variety of reasons, but mainly because there were labor shortages in the factories and they weren't able to meet the demands for notchbacks, Type 34s, Type 14 coupes and convertibles, Beetle convertibles, all that stuff. So they halted the Type 34 convertible product, and there were only 15 ever made.
So there were actually some production Type 34s put out there.
Yeah, they were never sold to the public.
Oh, really?
And the ones that were built were given away to the gross handler, the large VW dealerships in Germany, as a thank you for being a great dealership. And they were put in dealership showrooms and never sold.
Oh, so they were kind of given as like, here's a token of our appreciation, but you cannot sell this car.
Right.
That's wild.
And there's about 5 to 6 left today, all in Germany.
Yeah, that's crazy. And Christian Grunman's got a few of them, I bet. So
he has one. He has the Pacific Blue version. They were all made in white except for one for Mr. Karmann himself, and he made a light blue one. And at that time, that was called Pacific. And he's actually right now in the restoration phase of it, and it just got painted. I saw pictures of it today, actually.
And what year did they make the convertibles?
From October to December of 1962.
Perfect. So the convertibles were just really built for a super short period of time, and most of them ended up being prototype cars. Is that right?
Yeah, they weren't prototype. They were mass production cars. They went through the Karmann assembly process, and they got painted, and they got all the regular parts fitted to them. They just stopped it after only 15 cars.
That's crazy. And how many do they have a record of existing today?
Today, as far as we know, there's between 5 and 6
that people know.
And so that means that there's roughly 10 more that either people are going to find or that got crushed, or who knows what happened to them. But there's still, you're saying there's still a chance to find one.
That's it. Hey, all I need is a chance, right? So now,
that's right.
Let's get back to talking about some of the interior aspects that are unique to the early Type 3 variant.
Yeah. Yeah, the interior is another easy way to spot differences in earliest cars. And the easiest thing to see is the upholstery. There's something called a salt and pepper interior. And so it's a combination of vinyl and cloth. And the cloth is a unique pattern of black and white. That's why they call it salt and pepper. That is built into the interior and goes about halfway up the seats. And that's different than Karmann Ghias were, and it's different than the 1964 models were when they went with full vinyl interior.
Now, is the salt and pepper the same salt and pepper color that's in the bus too, in the later model bus?
No, that'd be too easy, wouldn't it? No, it's it's a different design. The bus one is actually like a mesh, and it's vinyl, right? It's not cloth.
Right. That's interesting.
And so this is a cloth.
And it's half cloth. It's pleated half cloth up to the center backs, and then it goes solid vinyl above that.
Right. It's actually two pieces, right? So you have the vinyl in the upper portion of the seats that has the heat seam in it. And then you have the lower portion, which is the cloth that goes on the seating areas. So when you're sitting in it, it's super comfortable. The door panels are also half and half. And the map pocket is made out of that same cloth material. So, yeah, it's super obvious when you see it. And it was only used in those first 61, 62, and 63 notchbacks and variants. The Type 31st had their own upholstery, not the salt and pepper. The problem with the salt and pepper is, from a restoration standpoint, is that it's totally obsolete, right? There's none available. And so there's a company, an interior upholstery company called SMS, and SMS has reproduced to that salt and pepper, which is how this car and a lot of cars were able to have their new upholstery made to match stock.
Now, is that in part in due to like people like Pedro, whoever, reaching out to them, sending them samples of the fabric, and then having them manufactured, or how are they getting this stuff done?
Yeah, that's how SMS really works. Is you find a swatch of cloth off an original upholstery, hopefully that's
Mhm.
been wrapped underneath the bottom of a back seat or something where the sun hasn't decayed it or bleached it, and then you cut that out and send it to them, and it's a whole process. And SMS is notorious for what projects they'll do and how long they take to do them. So it was almost a small miracle that we were able to get reproduction salt and pepper type 3 early year upholstery available.
Now, when you do that, do you guys have to commit to buying a solid bolt of fabric or so many yards of getting it?
The answer is sometimes. It
It,
depends if you're making full sets of upholstery or you're
mhm,
just buying a couple yards of the cloth to do yourself, right?
right.
An owner can't buy more than 4 or 5 yards. That's about all you need. But if you're a vendor that's planning on making seat covers and door panel sets, that's a different story. You need more.
Yeah. And then there's also, in respect to carpeting, anything different about the floor covering in it?
You know, they're German square weave carpet, and the early Type 3s used a solid rubber or plastic. I think it's a plasticky kind of rubber floor mat that wrapped all the way around the interior of the feet area, both in the front and the back. And that's one molded rubber piece instead of separate rubber floor mats that were typical in Beetles, where you could take them out and dust them off and throw them back in. This is one molded piece. And this, as you can imagine, the rubber is incredibly delicate and breaks if you look at it. So finding a complete molded early rubber front mat and rear mat is almost impossible.
And how, I mean, so no one's reproducing that as of yet?
No, of course not. You know, there's only a few cars out there, and almost nobody goes original restoration anymore. People are putting in carpet throughout the whole thing and making it easier on themselves.
Yeah, I mean, is the even the texturing of the fabric is a little bit different, or the plastic?
Uh, yeah, it's molded in a gosh, almost like a basket weave shape. You know, where and you can see in some of those close-up pictures just how the material looks, and it has definitely a texture to it.
Yeah, it looks almost like and sometimes I don't know if it would it be it wouldn't be Carmen building those. That would be the actual VW plant. So did they ever use on any other cars that you can sometimes cross it over from?
Yeah, we haven't found anything that we can cross over to this to make it match with. You know, we just haven't found anything that works.
Now, in respect to the seats, what else do we have interior wise that's unique to the early models?
Um, Inside, the early models used a rotary heater knob, which is a round knob, just like the Beetle and the Type 14 Karmann Ghia used. And that controlled, you turned the knob to get heat applied and come on, and you turned it off to push the cable and stop the heat from coming on. In the later years, in 64, they came out with a dual control that was on the tunnel near the e-brake. So the 61 to 63 cars have that rotary knob, and it has a little red dot on top of that on that ivory knob. So that's pretty unique for the inside. Um, the e-brake boot is an anthracite color rubber. Really hard to find an e-brake boot. You can see the gray shift knob and gear shift e-brake handle and that gray boot.
Those are
And the
color match to the gray.
yeah, anthracite it's called.
Yeah.
And in the dash, they have push button controls, also called piano keys, depends where you're from, that control the lights and the wipers and the rheostat for the gauges. And those signify all the early years up through 64. So that's a really nice way to spot an early car as well. In the Speedo, you'll see a red needle gauge for the speedo, and then it has a 140 kilometer or a 90 mile per hour dial. And those were early in the early years because, of course, you had the single carbureted car and it wasn't going more than 90. Once you got to 64 in the S model series, you were going 100, and they changed the speedometer to 100 instead of 90.
Yeah,
You can
it's
see the dash pad as well. The dash pad is an early style that wraps around the front of the car, very American-like. So the dash pad itself actually merges with the door pads to give it a round look, and it's called a wraparound dash. And those wraparound dashes cracked like crazy. Finding one is incredibly hard to do, and none are being reproduced that I know of. Typical prices for those for the early years are $1,500 to $2,500 just for the pad. So
yeah,
pretty ridiculous.
and the wraparound dash stopped in 66 or 64.
I think the wraparound dash stopped in 66.
Okay, and then also
Yeah, I think
window cranks.
so. The dished window cranks are the ivory dished ones. Those were used through 65 as well. They're plastic, so they break pretty easily. There are some solid ones that came out in 1966 that a lot of people prefer to use because they're more sturdy. But these dished ones are the ones that are correct and authentic for that early style.
Now,
If you look at the glove box, you'll see the glove box on these early Type 3s has a big button. It's it's about an inch in diameter. It's non-locking, and the glove box button was a feature that changed size in mid '63 and went to a smaller button. So if you ever find a Type 3 with a big button glove box, that's going to be an early model Type 3. This one has it, and it's 115,000 chassis number. So that's really early. That's like a November 62 car.
And what do you so? And that's the other question I have. If you know all like the cutoff dates and production dates and stuff like this, so like roundabout, if someone gives you a chassis number, you could say, "Oh, that's about a November or December or January." Are
Yep.
you not based on the monthly production of these cars?
Well, I mean, none of the monthly production is posted. On the Samba, there's some general dates like end of January. But what we base our numbers off of is by collecting the birth certificates from the owners. Volkswagen supplies birth certificates that if you give them your chassis number, they'll give you the actual production date and delivery date and location of where that car went. And so we record those, put them in a database, and we can help people identify, which chassis number is which date.
And then based on the originality of the car, then you can determine like big button, small button, details like that.
Yeah, exactly right. There's a big book called Progressive Refinements that Volkswagen put out that documented all the detail changes they made. And Progressive Refinements does document a lot of tiny details, but that's for the real book nerd that wants to spend days and days searching through every line item for just Type 3 changes.
And
I don't even do that.
And they produced a book where you could actually see every day the changes that were made in production.
Isn't that amazing? And they'll tell you things like big button glove box changed to small button glove box because it was easier to open or something like that. Volkswagen always made changes that were appropriate and efficient. And when they did make a change, they often documented them with a serial number of the first car that was applied with those serial numbers. So.
Oh, that's cool. Now, what about the interior wise? Anything unique about the seats, seat controls, or any of that kind of stuff?
Seat controls. Well, the seats sit on seat frames, and the seat frames for the early years were also gray, anthracite gray colored, and there's a large round knob that has a special design for the early years. The one you can see there has got an angled beveled edge that angles in a little bit. That's a 63 specific knob. You can see the square lift knob. That's to move the seat backwards and forwards. You have to lift it up to release it from the seat rails and slide it back and forth. Those went to chrome in later years. They went to different shapes in other years. And the early ones all have this gray. Real easy to spot.
Now, moving to interior of the trunk, there are a few unique things in the trunk interior as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the front compartment for an early Type 3 has the washer bottle. The windshield washer bottle is a different design, and it
Right.
sits down and is strapped into a space just underneath the brake reservoir. And so this was only used in the first few years and switched over to make it easier, I think. But the cap and the unit was hidden up underneath the front cowl, and all you saw was the filler port in 64.
And then there was also there's a one sticker that's under on the front hood area that's a little unique in regards to the some of the early
Yeah,
models. The
yeah, that's tire pressure, black sticker for tire pressure, front and rear, um, and you can see the green jack. I don't know if you can see a green canvas bag. It's about 2
I
feet
do,
long.
yeah, yeah,
Do you
there,
recognize the length of that? That's a jack off a bus,
yeah,
right?
no,
And it's in a
it,
green canvas bag. So we discovered that early variants do not have a jack storage clamp in the front of the car like the notchbacks do
mhm.
and the Type 34s do. So they stored this gigantic commercial sized bus jack in this green canvas bag and had a tie on it. And then that same green material was used to create the toolkit for the screwdrivers and the wrenches and all that. So they had green matching canvas bags up front for the early variants. And we just recently discovered that Everett Barnes's original black 63 has the original bag that we figured out and saw. And then a few more of them popped up, and the notchbacks don't have them. It's only variants.
And now you and yours in particular, you have a toolkit for yours. I being a VW guy and bug guy, I'm normally used to seeing the hubcap style toolkits.
Right. Yeah, those are the metal ones, right? That clip
Hmm.
inside the rims of the spare tire rim. For a Type 3, it's a little bit different because um, you had more tools available to you. This is a Hazit kit. It's called a Hazit Tourist 2. And this was a plastic kit with a larger diameter than the Beetle kits that you've seen. A lot more tools in them, too. And they had all the Hazit tools that you could need to service your Type 3. These kits were sold by the dealership. They weren't included with a new car, and they have different stampings on the front of them. So on the top, there's a stamping that'll say Hazit Tourist 2 or VW 1500 for some of the early ones. And so those are pretty collectible these days. I've seen a couple for sale that are in the 2,000 to 3,000 price range for the toolkit.
Holy cow! I mean, I was gonna say,
Yeah,
up until yours is almost like a tuna can, like a big tuna can, right?
yeah. I mean, they're fun because they do have all the tools in them, and they hinge open and closed, which is really nice. I store mine usually in the front trunk there, and it doesn't roll around or anything. It's heavy enough to sit still and not spill over. It's got a closing clip that keeps it all secure, and it's a good. I'm personally love working with VW tools. Hazit tools in particular, of course. So when I need a screwdriver, I open up that case and grab those tools and work on them. When I need a 27 or a 13 or whatever it might be, I grab the original tools. I think that's part of the joy of restoring a Volkswagen is having the right tools around you and feeling good that you're working just as those mechanics did back in the 60s.
Yeah, I think it's super cool, and you constantly discover new things. And I don't recall, I know my brother George, he had a Type 3 back when we were younger in the 90s, and his was a custom Type 3, but he went
Yep.
up with that vintage look. So he did the flat lenses, the orange needle gauges. He put all
Yep.
this in his 68 square back. And what was so funny is like we talk about the scarcity of these things, and as you're going through Pomona, like, oh look, it's cool, some orange needle gauges, grab them, we're going to use those. You know what I mean? And it
Right.
starts to become now the stuff that guys are doing to customizer stuff becomes really sought after and rare. And obviously, it came out of an early car at some point.
Yeah, or
I
off of the NOS shelf at a dealer.
Right, right. So
And remember, a lot because the cars weren't imported to the U.S. You had a lot of kilometer speedos that were being swapped out for miles per hour speedos, and so those in America, at least, there was a glut of kilometer red needle speedos that nobody was using.
Yeah, I know that even from my restoration of my Type 34, I still have an NOS Type 34 Speedo. So, and
Oh, nice,
I think it's for 65, but it just sits in my display
nice.
case. If we ever have anybody that needs one, you let me know, because I would gladly let it go to a good home to someone who needs that.
Yeah, I got a
That
whole
gauge.
garage of that stuff. So you let me
Yeah.
know when you need yours.
So now one thing we maybe overlooked on the interior wise would have been the rear view mirror. Was that unique to an early model?
So the rear view mirror is unique to a squareback, actually, and it has a little black. The chrome extension extends off of the arm and goes towards the windshield, and there's a little rubber black anti-vibration piece that mounts into that thing, so it snugs up against the glass and prevents the mirror from vibrating. Really strange. And mine doesn't have one. All the rubbers decay and fall out, and so really, really tough to find a original variant that has that black rubber piece in there. Most of them just have a hole, and everybody's wondering what went in there.
Yeah, and that's kind of the cool part of discovering something that was new, but it was old and a first generation versus the newer generation that had more as they started to refine the cars a little more. But it's neat to find all these little unique things, like with the toolbox. I've never even seen one of those toolboxes up until I've seen
Yeah,
yours. So I'm not.
yeah.
I'm sure they're quite rare. Now, getting back to the car, the engine. Now, there's some stuff specific to the engine in the rear.
Yep.
What are some of the things that we're going to look
So
at engine
when
wise?
the first Type 3s came out, they came out with the 1500 or 1494 cc motor, and they had a single Solex 32 PHN carburetor. And so that was mounted just north of the air cleaner sticker. You can see it there, the square shaped carburetor. And so everything in this engine bay was flattened. The air cleaner was flattened. You'll notice all of the intake that goes at the back of the motor was real tight and low. The coil is down low. Everything's at the generator and fan shroud height. The normal Beetle fan shroud that you're used to seeing is gone, and the cooling comes through the rear channel. There's a rubber boot that the air comes through the side vents and into the back of the motor through the crank. So you have improved cooling, and if your generator belt broke, you weren't forced to stop. All that stopped was stop charging the battery, which is a great improvement, right? In the Beetle, you break a fan belt and you're on the side of the road.
Yeah, and now with the new side draft, the new side draft and the compact design, it's really they changed the entire fundamentals of how the car cools. And there's questions back and forth with regards to the cooling vents on the side. Now,
right.
Eventually they changed the cooling vents down the side, correct?
That's a good question. All the early cars had the correct, early vents that go in. Are you talking about the ones that go in versus go out?
Correct.
Yeah. So all the early cars, the vents went in, and that may have been to prevent water, right? That I would assume to prevent water from coming into that space and getting into the car. I don't know if it aided it or not, but all the early cars have the in vents.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting because as Volkswagen, you look at the bus, the evolution of the bus when they go late model, they've got huge snorkels up top behind the rear quarter windows to improve the cooling as they started to increase horsepower in these cars. Now, getting back to the engine on the early ones, in the engine compartment, there was also something with the generator cover.
Yeah, so in the earliest cars, you can see the two 10 millimeter bolts that are holding on the generator cover. And there's actually another one on the other side, a 3-bolt design. And so this made it a little bit more complicated to get that cover off. In the later years, in 64, they came out with a clamp style that had clamps on either side of that cover that clamped onto the fan shroud. So this 3-bolt design is definitely a sign of an early engine.
And then let's see here. And that's the other shot is the single heat riser. Is that right? A single heat riser on this motor?
Yeah, it's a preheat. It's a preheat for the intake so that you would have nice warm air when you went to start a car on the cold day. It would have preheated air from the motor coming up out of the muffler and help with making the car run under cold conditions better. They did away with this after 64, and that preheat pipe was gone forever.
And then with respect to this heater, the heat bellow that's down low over there.
Right. You can see how rounded it is, right?
Yeah.
See how rounded it is, and it's got a central rib in it. So this is part of the early exhaust for the early single carbureted cars that has round heat exchangers. In the 65 model, they came out with a new style, which is a flat stamped steel kind of beast that is a definite easy thing to spot when you're looking at engine bay. This is these mufflers are super hard to find because they're maintenance, right? Because you throw them away after 15 or 20 years when they get rusty, and they're just super hard to find these days. Typical prices on an early muffler like that with a preheat pipe is going to be in the $400 to $500 range. When you compare that to a regular bus muffler at $75, that's a big difference for an early Type 3.
Yeah. And then with respect to closing out the kind of engine compartment, I've seen the reflective insulation material. Now that's factory.
So this one that's in this car, the factory stuff flaked off and the insulation came out over the last 60 years. And so this is a replacement that was put on. This is it's a dual purpose. It serves as a purpose for insulation, for noise, as well as heat. And it has 4 little clips that keep it in place, and the edges are glued into place. And it's what we used for this one was insulation material for a hot water heater. Comes in a roll. And it has a really nice diamond-shaped pattern that closely resembles the original. The original had kind of an aluminum finish to it, almost like a matte aluminum diamond-shaped finish. And this one is as good as we can get. Most people just leave the destroyed one in place and let the asbestos fly around, and they don't touch it.
Not advisable. And now closing the decklet is the notch in the top of the decklet. Is that indicative to an early car, or that's all square backs?
So square backs were variants were the only Type 3 model that had a strap and a hook to hold the trapdoor, the engine trapdoor up, and that hook clipped into the rain gutter on the back area. Once the rear window was open, once the hatch was open, this hook clipped onto the rain gutter. When you're storing it and the trapdoor is closed, the hook goes into that little opening there, that little oval shaped opening, and then the metal or the rubber mat for the cargo area goes over the whole thing, so you don't see it. So this round hole is unique to the early squarebacks, and that strap with the canvas hook is super difficult to find as well.
Now, I mean, we've pretty much covered just about all the unique aspects, which I never knew there were so many on an early variant. Now, in particular, this car, what is the story on this particular car, the history on this car in particular?
Yeah, so this is the 16th oldest Type 3 in the world. Its chassis number is around 115,000. It's pearl white, and it was discovered in 2017 on eBay, of all places. It was found listed in Nebraska, North Platte, Nebraska, and the grandkids of the owner. The original owner had bought it and pulled it out of his garage. It had been locked up and nobody even knew he had it until about 2017. They opened up his garage after he passed away and found this really poor condition. It was really bad at the time. Square back end there, and they put it on eBay for $800. Someone told them that it was a 64 model, and so nobody bought it. And I found it actually and looked at some of the components like the side marker lights that were the high markers. And I looked at the flat lights and the emblems and the big trim on the windows. I found, and I looked at it and I go, there's no way that's a 64. And so I wrote to the owner privately through eBay and I said, tell me what the chassis number of this thing is. And they looked it up. Sure enough, 115,000 is a November 1962 production. So a 1963 model year. So I said, you know, if nobody buys it on eBay, I'd be glad to buy it. And we negotiated and I bought it. And they were happy. They got rid of it. And we put it on a truck and brought it to San Diego.
So you had it shipped out to San Diego. What was the overall condition of this car when you got it? I mean, because it's Midwest.
It was sort of
Rust Belt, right?
Because it was stored for so long in the garage that it was really neat that it preserved the car from that perspective. The body, however, was a goldish color with various stages of Bondo, and obviously someone had painted it at some point and during its life when it was owned. And so it had been upgraded. The rear reflectors were upgraded to the chrome style. The front reflectors were updated to the chrome style. It had a whole bunch of weird things on it that just didn't belong, right? That were taken off other cars. So that's what confused most of the people on eBay, that it wasn't an early car.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's kind of a lucky thing that you caught this car, because it didn't sell on eBay, and then you end up negotiating a deal with the owner to get this car. And then this, I mean, it's so cheap, you have to buy it and say, I'm just going to put this in my reserves. This will be a future restoration project. And then you get the car, and then what happens then?
Well, I mean, if it was a 64, we would have passed on it, just because there are so many more 64 models out there than 63 models, right? I have another 63, a Gulf Blue one. And so we were lucky that it was a 63. Once we bought it and shipped it back, we had to do a whole bunch of work to it to get it to be a driver, to driving, because it obviously hadn't been running for a long time. And immediately my good buddy Pedro Saints in San Diego here decided that he wanted to own it. And since he's a restoration artiste, I gave it to him, sold it to him for what I paid for it, and he got it running. He rebuilt the motor and made it all complete and original, like a 63 model was. Then he worked on all the brakes and stripped all the brakes out of it, got all the right brake components, got it to be a daily driver, and took it to a couple of shows. Even though it was ugly, he took it to what's the big show in Southern California there with the 3,000 or 4,000 cars?
The Classic?
Prado.
The Classic? Prado.
Drove it to Prado as the 11th or 15th oldest variant in the world. So it was pretty cool that he got it as a driver. And then he put it on the shelf to do a restoration of another car.
And so this car has been between the two of you, this car has been in your possession since what year?
2017 was when we got it off eBay.
So he has it, gets it running, puts it back on the road, and then what finally triggers him to make the decision to start the full restoration?
So he put it on the shelf once it was a daily driver. He had originally imagined it to be a shop truck, right? To carry parts around and move engines back and forth and transmissions and all that. Only Pedro would do that, right?
Right.
And so he just let it sit there and worked on his Type 34 restoration. He's working on a pair of Type 34 restorations, and it took him 18 months to do those, lickety split, typical Pedro style. And then he decided to jump back in on the variant. So in 2021, when the dreaded COVID was happening, he decided to use his time jumping into the restoration of the body and the interior and everything else for this car.
And I mean, it's a phenomenal car. I mean, obviously people that are listening to this were probably looking at the magazine at the same time, but I find it so much more educating to actually get the history, because sometimes we just flip the pages, and if you're not a stock guy, or you're not a you're not a restoration guy, you may just turn the page and not pay any attention to this car. But I think, really looking at the uniqueness of the scarcity of the early cars and the uniqueness of it, it's really now, me personally, when I see the car, I'll stop and check it out, because there's so many unique parts and pieces to it that I find, it's really something that really grabs your attention. At least for me, it does now.
And it gives you a lot to look at when you go see some scorebacks out there now. See if you can find the push button and the big glove box and all those little tiny features that you wouldn't notice otherwise at a show, right? And if there's a car
Absolutely.
out in the parking lot that somebody drove to the event, you just might get lucky and find one.
Yeah, that's the thing for me. It's like, now with the opportunity that people have just to sit and listen to this podcast and really understand all the super unique early things. Hopefully, as what's happened with split windows over the past decade, there'll be a lot more early variants showing up, because now people are going to pay attention and really say to themselves, like, "Oh, that's an early one. It must be saved."
I
So
sure hope so. And when I got my first 63, it was important to me to find other owners to try and find the right parts, right? The early parts. And when I started meeting other owners of early cars, I started collecting chassis numbers and building a database. And out of that, we built a club, a group for the world. And the early variant registry came to be. And over the last, I don't know, what's it been, 5, 6 years, we've collected and searched out all the early 62 and 3 variants. And worldwide, even with all the connections and people that we know with Instagram, with Facebook, with websites, there's only 75 1963s and 10 1962s. So a total of 80, 85 total over those 2 years. So it's ridiculously low in the number of cars that are out there, and about half of them aren't even running.
yeah,
So
that's
to
I
find
mean,
one that's restored is just over the top, amazing. And to have
no,
one done by Pedro that's what I love the most about it, is he is so detail oriented that every little tiny detail was researched and asked 1,000 questions about, and then done right.
yeah, you could almost call him a fanatic when it comes
He's
to it.
a to the power of 2.
Yeah, but I think it's great, because so many of these cars have probably been passed over and forgotten about, and they weren't paid attention to, because it's just a quote unquote square back. But as
Right?
the hobby continues to progress, everybody starts really getting into the weeds of the uniqueness of early models and first models and things to that extent, where, from Zwitter Beetles to early variants now. And
Yep.
I'm pretty excited, and I think I predict one day we'll probably have a podcast on the uniqueness of the first year fastback to the second year fastback, because
Right.
I think
It's
as
coming.
more people start to dig down into that stuff, every time we take it for granted when we buy my wife drives a Toyota Highlander. Well, the first year to the second year, there's a numerous amount of improvements, and as we look back in history, we look at the square back, because Volkswagen was so committed to keeping. They put so much forethought in the original design. The overall design didn't change. It was minor refinements, you know. And I think that, you know, at first glance, you look at a square back and you think, or a variant, you just say, it's just a square back. But now, as we start to break down the minutia of the earlies and those things, I mean, I'm really gaining, as a custom car guy, I'm gaining a huge appreciation for some of the restored cars because of these conversations. So I appreciate everything you're doing. I know you're the guy when it comes to doing the Type 34 registry, the Type 3 registry, and put it, like, when somebody's like, "Oh, somebody should do that," it's usually Lee Hedges jumping up and doing that, because no one else will, and
Because
and
I'm
you're the
silly.
guy. Well, but I think you're a little bit ahead of the curve in paying attention to these details that a lot of people overlook. I know I personally have overlooked a ton of them, and I'm going to be. I'll be picking up shortly a Gia TC that I've got coming. So,
Oh, wow.
uh, so I mean,
I run the
you know,
registry for that too, by the way.
I know that's why I brought it up. So how many? So
My buddy
speaking of Gia,
John had one, so I started that for him.
and how many Gia TCs did they produce overall total? Do you know? Is there a production number
Uh,
out there?
oh, I didn't look up the cliff notes for that one, but I
That's
think
all
it's
right.
like 117,000 or 20,000. I can't even remember. Can't even
Yeah.
remember.
Well, we'll
But God,
follow up with a
there's like 100 left.
we'll follow up with a podcast on that when I get mine. So it's
Sounds good.
definitely
I'll
great.
let you take over the registry.
I'll be the lone guy on the registry.
No, we got a lot of them. We have a huge presentation from the rest of the world, and there's probably 100 of them out there. So everybody's
Yeah.
super excited about that one as well.
So
It's a
Lee, if
great
people want
looking
to,
car.
it is. To me, it looks like a baby Maverick. Ford
Yeah.
Maverick. You know,
A lot of
but
people say it looks like the mating of a Carmen Ghia and a 911.
yeah, it does. It's got a lot of unique features. But
Yeah.
uh, anybody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Google's best. You can type in my name, and that usually pops up. You can go to Facebook and type in my name, and that pops up.
And as
You
far
can
as the
ask
Type
anybody. You can,
34 world,
my email is leehedges at t34world.org, and you can send me emails. You can message me. I'm pretty much on all the platforms, so you can ask around, and somebody will find me.
and what you like the most is to get the VIN numbers, just so we can
That's just
try
the
to
only
track
way.
all the cars.
It's the only way to prove it's a unique car and to follow
Yeah.
it. Photos, there's no way to do that. And taking your word that it's a 62 just doesn't work. Everybody thinks that they have what they have until we prove otherwise. And part of the reason is that once you know exactly what it is, then you know what the right parts for it are, and we can help you find the right parts for it. And that's
Yeah.
the whole reasoning behind it, because Volkswagen has so many changes. We've shown them here, but so many changes over just a 1 year period, and it's all based on what the chassis number of the car is. So
Well, man, I
we really
listen,
love
Lee.
helping people.
Yeah, no, I commend you 100% for everything that you're doing for the hobby, man. And before we wrap up, anything that you wanted to, any special thanks for people that are kind of on your team that help you through this massive hunt of everything? I know we got Pedro out there.
Man, my amigos, we have a couple amigos here in San Diego that we stick together. And Pedro Saints, Jack Fisher, Jason Weigel, myself, and Eric Hand, who's up in Northern Cal. We're really work hard to help each other get the parts we need, buy the parts we need, borrow each other's stock when somebody doesn't have the part they need. And those four guys really step up every single time somebody's working on a car.
Wow.
And they research, and they just go the full distance to help everybody out. So I couldn't have done anything without them.
Oh, that's fantastic, man. Well, listen, I appreciate everything you do, Lee, and I think it's definitely it's a lot of work, and I know that you do it because you love the hobby that much, and it's the
Oh,
same
for
reason I do the
sure.
podcast. You know what I mean? No one's paying me to do this, but I do it
That's
because
right.
it's important work that I believe is it's entertaining, it's educational, it's everything on so many levels, and I enjoy it, and that's why I really dig talking to you about this stuff, because I know you're obsessed about it, and thanks for everything you do, man.
Well, it goes both ways. We've known each other for quite a while, and you picked a niche that really has been monumental in getting people to know who the real players were in the VW industry, and to see the faces and hear their words and preserve their passions into history. So it's a really unique something you've done, and I'm proud of you. It's awesome.
Hey, I appreciate it, buddy. Well, I look forward to seeing you at the next event, wherever I'm going to be, wherever you'll be. Hopefully, I don't know. I may somehow try to figure out how to get down there to to San Diego for something. I do have that wheel for you. I've already taken care of that, and that has been secured. So that is going to be a gift from me to you,
Perfect.
because I told my friend, I said, well, let me know what it costs. And he says, no, I explained who you were. He says, no, man, a guy like that deserves to have this wheel because of what he's doing. Just give him the wheel.
Yeah.
So it's,
Well, you're going to need a couple of parts for your Type 34 anyway. And mi
one
casa
day.
es su casa.
That's it. Well, I just got to start turning wrenches. It's up on the rack, and I got to start bolting the pan up and start making some progress. But I plan to
Yep.
get there sometime soon. Well, cool.
Well, I'm here to
Lee,
help.
thanks so much for everything, man.
Of course, buddy. Thanks
All
for
right.
having me on.
You got it.